Welcome to the 21st Annual Lake Links Workshop. Our theme today is Challenges and Solutions for Lake and River Health. And we're gonna dive deep and see how organizations and associations have recognized threats on their lakes and rivers and what steps they're taking to address them. So I think it's going to be, we've got a really great lineup of speakers today. And I'm so happy you all could join me, even though the weather outside is fantastic. So I really appreciate you tuning in this morning. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Melissa Dakers, and I work for Watersheds Canada, and I am part of the Lake Links Planning Committee. Our planning committee is made up of many organizations, including Cataraqui Conservation, Rideau Valley Conservation Authority, Mississippi Valley Conservation Authority, the Tay River Watershed, the Friends of the Tay Watershed, sorry, and as well as the Lake Networking Group and Watersheds Canada. And we are all so happy that you were able to join us today online. We had high hopes that today would be in a smaller session in person in the afternoon, but due to COVID and the pandemic, we're just kind of leering on the side of caution right now, just to make sure everybody stays safe. We are hoping that next year will be an in-person event, so stay tuned for more information on that later on. Okay, so everybody can see my screen well. We can just do a bit of housekeeping. So I guess most of you are probably familiar with the Zoom platform. It's been through almost 3 years of the pandemic, and if you're not too familiar, most of the platforms are similar. But for Zoom that we're using today, in the left bottom corner, you'll see that your mic is muted and your video is also turned off. Like I mentioned, we're trying to save bandwidth and make sure that the speakers have clear audio. And in the center there, you'll notice that we have a chat function. If you have any questions for our speakers throughout the presentations, please put them in the chat. We have Watersheds Canada staff, our Jane, Nicole, and Monica are monitoring chat rooms and everything. So we'll be able to ask questions after each presentation. We'll take a few minutes and take some of those from the chat. So if you do have any questions or concerns for any of us, please put it into the chat. And then if you do have to leave us, which I'm hoping you don't, in the bottom right-hand corner is the leave button. And so if you do have to leave the event, just press that red button. So that's a little bit of our features. Okay, so a little bit about our agenda today. Like I said, we have a great lineup of speakers. I'm not going to go through each one of them, as we'll be doing introductions throughout the presentations, but I'm very excited to hear everyone and to see how people are managing their lakes and rivers and dealing with challenges and threats to their freshwater and the wildlife ecosystems. So we have 4 presentations today for you, as well as you will be meeting the next Gord Rogers Memorial Award presentation later on. So why don't we start with our first speaker, and I'm going to ask Mike Yee from Rideau Valley Conservation Authority to introduce Jesse Vermeire.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, it's my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Jesse Vermaire. I've worked with him on some projects, and he brings a wealth of knowledge. So just a brief bio on Dr. Vermaire. He is currently an associate professor with the Institute of Environmental Science and cross-appointed with the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Carleton University. His research focuses on the long-term impacts of human activities in freshwater resources. Jesse maintains a research interests in human impacts on nearshore habitat in lake ecosystems, microplastic pollution of fresh water, and the environmental impacts and recovery of aquatic ecosystems exposed to a legacy of contamination. He employs a number of approaches ranging from paleolimnology to bioindicators to understand the long-term impacts of human actions on freshwater systems to help inform management and conservation of lakes and rivers in our changing environment. So I'll turn it over to Jesse to share his information with you. Thanks, Dr. Vermeire.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Every time I hear that read out, well, not every time, but I always think I need to shorten that. I'm going to put that on my to-do list now, so I don't need such a long bio. But hi, everyone, and thanks for inviting me today. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the challenges that our lake ecosystems are facing, mainly related to climate change and invasive species, a bit about what the work we're doing with Eurasia milfoil, and I see Fred's talk after mine is on that topic as well. So I'm interested to hear his talk. So I also apologize. I find Zoom presentations super hard. I haven't mastered them despite the 3 years we're in now, or whatever it is, 2 and whatever. So if I apologize in advance if I start stumbling a bit, because you're kind of in your own world, I find, when you're giving these. But anyway, we'll get started. You can go to the next slide, please. So humans have left their mark on pretty much every ecosystem on the planet, and aquatic ecosystems aren't any different. And in fact, freshwater ecosystems are some of the most impacted ecosystems on the planet in terms of biodiversity loss and pollution. And that's largely because they're downhill from all of human activity. So all the pollution that we put on the landscape, the road salts, the fertilizers, most of it ends up eventually in our lakes and rivers. And because of all these changes, freshwater ecosystems have had a really big decline in biodiversity, sort of on the scale of the Amazon rainforest in terms of biodiversity loss globally. So we've had a large impact on these systems, and mainly related to sort of land use changes, as we cut down forests for urban development or new subdivisions or farms over the years, invasive species, pollution, and the big one that we're facing in the future is related to climate change. And I guess I shouldn't say just in the future, we're experiencing some of those changes now. Next slide. So human activities are changing the world, are changing the planet, and this change is occurring really quickly from sort of a geological time sense or even a human lifespan time frame. And this level of change for the planet is relatively new. And I put this picture up because it's a picture of my oldest son, Thomas, my oldest kid, Thomas, when he was 4 months old, and we were visiting my wife's family in New Brunswick, and he's sitting with his great uncle Warren, who was 99 years old at the time. And I just put this picture up to sort of remind me that the changes that we've seen on the planet have happened really quickly. They've happened essentially within the lifespan of a person that you could still sit in a room with today. A lot of changes have happened even within my lifespan, and there's certainly, it's been only really a few decades, 70 years or so, that these changes have really happened and really begin to ramp up to ecosystems. Next slide. So for just an example, when Warren, in that last picture, was 99 when it was taken, when he was 4 months old, there's only about 1.8 billion people on the planet. And when Thomas was 4 months old, we're up to 7 billion, and now we're at 8 billion. There was only about 1.1 million motor vehicles on the planet, and probably like 5 in New Brunswick where that picture was taken. I don't know for sure, but and now we're up over 1 billion. And there was no commercial air travel at all when Warren was 4 months old. And now, pre-COVID, and we're probably back to it now, there was over 9 million flights a day in the US alone. And the pictures at the bottom just show, what Ottawa, downtown Ottawa looked like when Warren was born in 1913 versus what it looks like when Thomas was 4 months old, sort of basically 100 years later. So the level of change has been really dramatic over a very short period of time, someone's lifespan that you could sit in a room with and talk to. Next slide, please. And this is true for a lot of both environmental and social variables that we look at, such as the blue slides on my left anyway show trends in Earth system processes, like the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and how that's changed through time, nitrous oxide, methane, surface temperature, all these sort of Earth system processes, and how they really started to ramp up sometime around 1950, so post World War II. And these changes in these Earth system trends are also related to changes in our socioeconomic trends, like our population, our real GDP, so a measure of wealth, foreign direct investment, which is a measure of globalization, the amount of urban population, water use, and so on. So, and this again also started to ramp up around 1950. And this time period is what people are calling sort of the start of the Great Acceleration. This not sort of all these changes that started to happen in the Earth system and through human activities, and also the socioeconomic trends. So we've seen, changes to carbon dioxide emissions, water use, damming of rivers, all starting to increase around 1950. But at the same time, it's important to remember that there's also been, depending on how you measure it, but improvements in human well-being. Certainly, our life expectancies increased, our wealth has increased. So there's been sort of these trade-offs, I guess, between our impact, our activities, and our impact on the environment, but our socioeconomic well-being, depending on how you define well-being, I guess. Next slide, please. So this has led these really big changes in both, mainly in the Earth system process, has led scientists to sort of debate, have we entered a new geological epoch, so new geological time period that they're calling the Anthropocene. And the proposed start of the Anthropocene that's being debated right now, so it's not officially accepted. There's a whole process that takes years that it has to go through before being officially accepted to the geological record as a time interval. But the proposed date of the start of it is the start of this great acceleration, so around the 1950s. And it's really marking a time period where human processes or human activities are altering Earth system processes on a global scale, like altering the global carbon cycle, altering the global water cycle, altering the global nitrogen cycle and phosphorus cycle, for example. So, so what's being debated in the geological community isn't really if humans are having a big impact, but it's more, is this impact going to be large enough that a million years in the future, alien geologists will be able to look at our sediment and rock record and see, when these human impacts at a global scale really started to take off. But the evidence is sort of pointing that yes, and I think it will happen, that this is going to be formally recognized as a new geological epoch, which is sort of amazing. And it means we've essentially left the Holocene that we've been in for the last 11,000 years, slightly longer. And we, in around 1950, entered this new geological epoch called the Anthropocene. And just as an aside, one of the geologists like to put these precise stratigraphic units. They have a global type for it. So the one record that sort of represents it all, and people can go back to And they're debating what that record should be for the start of the Anthropocene. But one of the sites is in Canada. It's one of the leading contenders, and it's Crawford Lake, which is, I think, just north of Toronto, I believe. And it has a really nice sediment record of varved, laminated sediment that you can sort of go back in time and count and look at how changes have occurred, just like you could with tree rings. Next slide, please. And, it's important that we, especially if we're looking at it's important, if we are in the Anthropocene and our human actions are sort of impacting these global biogeochemical cycles like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus, it's important that we learn to sort of mitigate and adapt to the impacts of these changes, both climate change and changes in nutrient cycling, because we get a lot of important environmental goods and services from our freshwater ecosystems. We get important provisioning services like drinking water from these systems that we need to protect, fisheries, recreational and a little bit of commercial fisheries that we need to protect. We get important regulatory services from these freshwater bodies, like helping prevent or slow down floods. We get really important cultural services from freshwater ecosystems, whether that is, recreation or just feeling relaxed when you're at your house or your cottage or out on the water, and just helping you essentially either recreate or relax. That's an important service as well. And important supporting services like the production of filtering contaminants out of water that wetlands provide, and also oxygen production through photosynthesis occurring in the water. Next slide, please. And this is important because we want to sort of protect the and conserve the great resources we get from freshwater ecosystems. And we can all look at these pictures, and there's other ones as well, but it just makes me happy looking at these, and we really value these services that are provided by freshwater ecosystems, and it's important that we work to protect them. Next slide. And one way of thinking about this that's being discussed is, okay, if we are, entering the Anthropocene, it doesn't have to be all bad. It doesn't have to be this dystopian future. We have a lot of knowledge about, what needs to be done to help make a good Anthropocene, as they call it. And this is just a figure from one paper that's sort of pointing out these bright spots, as they call them, seeds of a good Anthropocene globally. And if you look at this figure, the green lines, the green sort of spaghetti lines, represent environmental quality, and the blue lines represent human well-being, however you want to think about human well-being. And in the past, we had, really strong environmental quality and maybe less good, I guess, human well-being. And we're talking about the distant past here. And then through, innovation and development of land and land clearing, we're sort of now at the stage where environmental quality is declining. Maybe, well, it is declining, I guess, in a lot of systems, although there's some examples of recent improvements, and human well-being has increased. But the goal for the future, should be to sort of keep human well-being up, and we want, all the good things that come from human activities to remain, but also improve environmental quality. And this has been termed sort of like a good Anthropocene, instead of imagining a dystopian future where both the environment is destroyed and along with it, human well-being, because we depend on a healthy environment for our well-being. Next slide. So now I'm going to move on to talking about sort of climate change as an ecological stressor for lakes. And this figure comes from a relatively recent paper in lake and reservoir management. And this is a figure thinking about Wisconsin lakes, but it's very similar for the lakes in Ontario here. But if we're talking about how we can help, our lake ecosystems, how we can conserve our lake ecosystems and help mitigate the impacts of climate change or adaptive approaches to climate change, it's important that we, build healthy or, conserve healthy lake ecosystems. And there's some terms they use here. They use the term, resistance. And from an ecosystem standpoint, resistance is the ability of the ecosystem to defend or protect against changes. So, even if the ecosystem or the lake has a lot of resistance, even though there might be a little bit of land use change in the catchment, the lake ecosystem doesn't change. It's quite healthy beforehand, and it's got this resistance to changing in the face of the stressor. They also talk about resilience, and resilience is basically, if an ecosystem is disturbed either through maybe a pulse of pollution to an ecosystem or a big storm, it does change a little bit, but it quickly comes back to what the ecosystem was like before, if it had high resilience. So that would be, the resilience of the ecosystem to recover from these disturbances. And then response would be basically to minimize undesired outcomes. So when there is this disturbance, how big is the change? And you want to sort of make the change as small as possible. And, the authors of this study point out that really the conservation, as we all know here, the conservation of aquatic ecosystems, lake ecosystems, really is part about ecosystem science, and it's part about human dimensions as well. It's really humans around the lake that are doing the work to help conserve it. It's really the need to get humans and people to care about the conservation of the lakes and to get on board with a lot of the activities. And it's really humans, when we talk about ecosystem health of a lake, it's really from a human perspective. It's sort of what people like to see in their lake. And that really goes back to those ecosystem services. We like, clean water that we like to swim in, that we want to drink, that we're happy to fish in. So it's really this link between, human dimensions and ecosystem science that we need to be looking at for adapting to climate change. And the actions that they point out are, communication and outreach is always important, because you need people to see the value in making the effort to conserve these resources. There needs to be policies and regulations, of course, to help conserve the resources. Innovation and engineering, as we sort of enter, at least in our modern human history, unprecedented times for the climate, we're going to need innovative solutions to the impacts on lake ecosystems. And traditional conservation is also important, because we know a lot about lake ecosystems already. For example, the importance of limiting phosphorus to lake ecosystems is well understood. We've known that for decades, and a lot of good work's been done to help limit phosphorus inputs to our aquatic ecosystems, and that helps build that ecological resilience in the system. Next slide. So this figure is just, there's a lot in here, but this is from a paper co-authored by John Small at Queen's University, who some of you might know. He's also very highly involved in limnology and lake ecosystem management. But just pointing out, some of the changes that have occurred related to climate change already in lake ecosystems globally, and what's sort of projected to occur in the future under different climate change scenarios. And the big ones they're showing here are reduction in ice cover days. You may have witnessed that in some of the lakes you're around. So there's a longer open water season now in a lot of our lakes, so just a longer growing season occurring in the lakes as well. Longer periods of thermal stratification. So when you get that warm water on top and the colder water underneath in the summer, that's occurring for a longer period of time now because of global warming. And again, that's projected to continue. And that has changed a number of things about the lake, but one that's clearly been shown is the algae community in the lake now. With longer stratification, it's favoring lighter algae with less of a sinking rate. And of course, water temperatures are increasing as well, and that's projected to continue. Next slide. And this figures from that same paper co-authored by John Small. But just where we start to expect to see or the level of risk, additional risk associated with climate change. And we've got a thermometer on the left-hand side, just showing, increasing global temperatures. There's no numbers on this because we don't know exactly where these changes to occur. It's more a probability based thing. But, even at relatively small increases, you start to see, and we've seen this already, like ice cover loss. So a longer ice-free season in our lakes. And with that surface warming, with increasing global temperatures, we get, an elevated risk of reduced mixing in our lakes. So this longer thermal stratification, higher evaporation, water level changes occurring. And with warmer temperatures and longer stratification, there's the possibility of reduced cold water fish habitat and increases in cyanobacteria, so blue-green algae blooms, because they do better with longer growing seasons and warmer surface water temperatures. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just talk now about some of the research that students in my lab have been doing on lakes around here related to these questions. And part of what we're looking at is a study on what is structuring the algal communities. And this project was along the Rideau Canal system. And these photos here are just sort of, some of the algae that we're finding in the Rideau Canal. And a lot of them are, diatoms, which are in the upper left. You may have heard about those. Cyanobacteria, so the blue-green algae. There's green algae, and there's other types of algae, and they all occur naturally in the system. If you looked at enough water from any lake, you'd find all these different types for sure. But what changes, sort of what is the most dominant type of algae, is really related to the environment, and also the environment, so nutrients, but also water temperature as well. So in the Rideau system, Lindsay Trache was the student doing this work, and she was just taking grab samples along the Rideau system throughout the year, and looking at sort of what was driving the changes in the algal assemblage. Next slide. So we can see here the different, the Rideau Canal system in this map. So is trying to use my pointer, but we're from Ottawa to Kingston, and where the location of the sampling occurred. And we can see there's different things structuring the algae community in these aquatic ecosystems. You have basically changes as you go throughout the summer, and that's normal. You go from more of a diatom sort of community at most sites, shown in purple here in these graphs. And that's because the diatoms, they grow really quickly, and they're really able to take advantage of all the nutrients available in the lake in the spring after ice off. They're sort of one of the first algae to really take off. And then as we progress through the months into August, you start to see more cyano, showing that as sort of this bluish green color. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but more cyanobacteria dominating in the sites. And again, that's a very normal pattern. We see that in sites, across, many different lakes across Canada and the US. And it's really because cyanobacteria like that warmer water. They grow a bit slower than diatoms. So they do better, as the season progresses and you get into warmer waters in late August and into the fall. So, that's a normal pattern, and that's sort of related as well to, climate change. If we start to get a longer ice-free season with warmer water temperatures, we might see those cyanobacteria blooms occurring earlier and earlier in the summer. Next slide, please. So there's that seasonality involved in structuring the algal community, but there was also an important environment. Well, that's part of the environment, but also important spatial component in that you'd saw, in the lower lakes of the canal system closer to Kingston that tend to have higher nutrients, you're also seeing more cyanobacteria in them, relatively speaking. And these we've looked at what is structuring these algal community, and the most important one is environment, which explains about 18, roughly, say 20% of the variability in the algal community, and that is really related to nutrients and water temperature. And then just even time alone, month here in this Venn diagram, independent of how the month changes the environmental conditions, is also significantly important. It's a low percent, but around 4 or 5% of the variability in the algal assemblage, and that's just because some species take a bit longer to grow. But we do see, despite the time of month on these sort of stacked bar plots on the right-hand side, different relative abundances of the algae. And we can see in August, there's quite a bit of cyanobacteria at some of the sites in the canal system near Kingston, for example, site A and B. By the time we get to August, cyanobacteria is sort of the dominant algae we're seeing at these sites. Next slide, please. So one concern we're looking at is sort of trying to understand if the abundance of cyanobacteria is increasing in our lakes in this area. And this is a worry, as many of you probably know. The concern around cyanobacteria is some strains of this bacteria can produce toxins that are, that are dangerous to animals, including humans, if we consumed a large amount of the water. And that's why you'd see signs around lakes that have really frequent algae blooms warning you to stay out of the water, or keep your pets out of the water. And we can see, from our last slide, that some sites have relatively high concentrations of cyanobacteria related to other algae in the system. And we wanted to understand, has it always been that way in these lakes? And one lake that we were working on to sort of get at this question was Dog Lake. So that's in the portion of the Rideau Canal a bit closer to Kingston than to Ottawa. And it does have, in recent years, what I've been told is fairly frequent cyanobacteria blooms in dog lakes, and residents around there are concerned about the decline in water quality in their lake. And it's also important to mention that Dog Lake the surface area of Dog Lake was really expanded with the construction of the canal. So it has a pretty large, shallow water area, and it is a more nutrient-rich lake on the Rideau Canal system. So to get at this question of if cyanobacteria were increasing in the lake over time, we did a study taking a lake sediment core. And for those of you who haven't heard about this before, by taking a lake sediment core, you can sort of, slice up the sediment and go back in time. You can and look how conditions in the lake have changed, and you can date the sediment core using radioisotopes like carbon-14 and lead-210 to get an idea when these changes occurred. So we took some sediment cores from Dog Lake, and we were working with, this project was sort of spurred by a meeting that we had a few years ago now, pre-COVID, at the Cataraqui Region Conservation Authority, and residents on the lake and the Cranberry and Dog Lake associations, and their concerns around water quality changes in their lakes. So next slide. Okay, so there's a lot on this slide. I know, and these stratigraphic figures that are on the left here can be hard to read, but the key points here are that if we look at that stratigraphic figure on the far left, the first column is organic matter content, and we can see where that orange horizontal line is. That's where we think, we don't have good dates down there yet, but that's where, based on the algae community and changes to other components of the lake ecosystem, where we think canal construction occurred, and it sort of changed the hydrology of Dog Lake. And then in the column beside that is the amount of chlorophyll A, so that's the photosynthetic pigment. And that is a proxy measure just for the amount of algae occurring in the lake. And you can see it went from, before canal, maybe more of a wetland environment with more algae, to less algae in the lake. The next column, DITP, that's diatom inferred, and diatoms are those algae. Diatom inferred total phosphorus. So we don't have monitoring data going back this far in time, so we have to infer what conditions were like based on what algae was there. So what the nutrient concentration, what the phosphorus concentration was like. And the important point here is that there hasn't been a ton of changes, at least inferred through the diatoms, in the total phosphorus of Dog Lake. And if anything, it's maybe declined in recent years. But it's always been, sort of nutrient rich, kind of mesotrophic to eutrophic, just naturally. And the next two columns are just sulfur and the calcium to titanium ratio, and that has to do with erosion into the lake. And there's not a big evidence for changes occurring in that either since canal construction. And the diatom inferred total phosphorus sort of supports what we're seeing in the monitoring record as well, which is shown on the graph on the right from data I just took off the web from the Cataraqui Region Conservation Authority report. But again, there isn't a lot of changes, at least in the monitoring record they've reported here, in the total phosphorus through time from 2009 to 2015 here. It's been sort of stable, but sort of at that sort of mesotrophic to eutrophic kind of phosphorus concentrations. But the change we did observe in the sediment record of Dog Lake is the amount of microcystin toxins occurring. And that's shown in orange, and I've circled it in blue here. And this is a toxin released by some cyanobacteria. And this is work done by Ethan McCann, who is a master's student in chemistry at Carleton, working under Professor David McMillan in the chemistry department. And they, developed this technique to extract the microcystin toxin from the sediment, and they can track that over time. And around 2007 or 2005, the mid 2000s, there's some error with the dating, but we see the amount of cyanotoxins or microcystin in the sediment core really starting to increase, despite not seeing really big changes in the diatom inferred phosphorus. So this is still a work in process, but I would interpret this as sort of being related to more of a climate change signal in the lakes. Again, with that longer growing season and longer open water season and warmer water temperatures that cyanobacteria like, we're seeing more evidence of cyanobacteria blooms in the last 15 or so years in Dog Lake based on the sediment core. And I think from what I've heard from residents on the lake, that would be sort of consistent to what my impression was and what they were saying as well, that we didn't always used to experience these frequent blooms, and really there hasn't been much changes in phosphorus. What's going on? Next slide, please. And this is sort of a similar pattern to what's been seen in other lake systems. And again, this is a paper from work by John Small at Queen's University and others, but they've reported similar things in remote lakes in Algonquin Park, for example, that don't have any real changes in land use or phosphorus inputs around the lake. But in recent times, they're seeing evidence of increasing cyanobacteria blooms. And if you take a sediment core from these lakes, which the bottom sort of graph shows, it looks like, these recent spike in these microfossils related to cyanobacteria sort of wasn't occurring in the past. It's a new thing. And again, they're tying that to global warming and climate change and this longer ice-free period, warmer water temperatures, and a longer growing season. Next slide. So, no one likes cyanobacteria blooms in their lakes, and it's important that we do our best to sort of limit the conditions that cyanobacteria like and thrive. And predicting when a cyanobacteria bloom will occur is notoriously difficult. We can't do that yet because it depends on so many different environmental conditions. But this figure, from a recent systematic review that was published, shows we do know sort of what the key drivers are, and they're shown with these green arrows. They've looked at a whole bunch of papers that tried to build predictive models of when cyanobacteria blooms will occur and what sort of the key predictors are in those models. And it really comes back to, phosphorus is key and water temperature is key. There's some other variables that have shown more complicated results, like nitrogen. Sometimes it is important. Sometimes it has a positive influence on cyanobacteria, sometimes a negative influence. But really the two that always come out in these models is phosphorus and water temperature. And we've known, about the importance of phosphorus for a long time. And I think now we're beginning to understand, the importance of water temperature as well, and what global warming might mean. But the other important point here is that global warming, that's something that's difficult to control at your local watershed scale. It doesn't mean we shouldn't take action for it, but phosphorus is sort of that one variable that we can control a bit more at the watershed scale, where our actions, even on our own property, can have an influence on the lake ecosystem. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide, I just made that point. Sorry, I meant to make it during this slide, but again, it's the phosphorus is sort of the local scale, and we've known about this since the 1970s with David Schindler's important work in the experimental lakes area in northwestern Ontario, where you can just see with this curtain, this famous photo, the side of the lake where they added phosphorus to just bloomed in this massive cyanobacteria bloom. And really that's the variable that at the local scale we have the most control over. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to quickly, I'm aware of the time and I'm going to try and wrap this up super quickly. So I'm just going to go over just some work we've also been doing with invasive macrophytes and shoreline alterations, and mainly the Eurasian water milfoil that you're all aware of. Next slide. We've done some work looking at where people are applying for permits and for macrophyte removal in the Rideau Canal, because you're supposed to apply through Parks Canada to it. And you can see, again, it's in many of these lakes that are more nutrient rich, where there's more permit applications. And these are also the shallower systems that were maybe more wetland like before canal construction. Next slide. So we want to, work and understand what the removal of macrophytes, what impact it's having on aquatic ecosystems, and how we can best go about it when you have too many invasive macrophytes in front of your property. A lot of people have concerns about it and look at ways of removing it. So we've done some studies with Malcolm and Ardagh Lake Association, putting down burlap mats shown on the left here, kind of, trying to kill the Eurasian milfoil. And then we've also looked at the impact of macrophyte cutting in the Rideau Canal system. Next slide. And the big take home here is that we don't see a ton of changes related to the cutting of macrophytes. The changes that because the cutting only gets sort of the top layer of the macrophytes, and the changes that we see occurring with the burlap are more related to zooplankton. So the bigger zooplankton, they like to hide in the plant. So when the burlap was put down, they sort of left the open water area and went to hide in the plants. Next slide, please. And we're tracking these over time because the hope is with the burlap mats that so they're biodegradable. That's the idea with them. And this, just compares the year they were laid down in 2019 to 2020, and you can already see them starting to biodegrade. And we're going to be tracking them over time because the hope is that native aquatic plants will sort of replace the Eurasian milfoil. And we see preliminary evidence of that shown here. We see more potamogetons growing through the burlap. But these were sort of small strips of burlap in a big Eurasian milfoil bed. So likely the Eurasian milfoil will encroach in still. Next slide. So we're doing this on a larger scale now with the National Capital Commission and trying to treat a whole Eurasian milfoil bed. We just laid down some burlap this past fall. It's this massive roll that's like 12 feet wide and like a kilometer long. I think it was a huge effort. And there's just sort of the team standing by it. So this is in Lac Philippe in Gatineau Park. Next slide. And we essentially covered that macrophyte bed shown there with the arrow, and our goal was covering 3,000 meters squared, so quite a large area. Next slide. And that's just an aerial shot of what the benthic mat looks like, this biodegradable benthic mat. So we'll be following that over the years to come to see how the ecosystem or the macrophyte bed recovers, and our hope is that we start to see more native macrophytes replacing the invasive. Next slide. Okay, so this goes back again to what we talked about in the beginning, the need for community outreach and innovative and innovation and engineering techniques where the mats occurred. Next slide. I'm speeding through it now. But I just want to point out that even though there are these important human impacts on lakes, we do see evidence of improving ecosystem health. And these data are from the Credit Valley Conservation Authority, where and based on their 10-year report from 2002 to 2011. And you can see, it's always nice to see this type of data because it shows, that even though the improvements might be slow and it might be hard to remember year from year how things have changed, and when you look at the longer term monitoring data, you often see improvements in water quality, improvements in benthic invertebrates, water quality, and here they also show bird biotic index. And it's just, good to see that the work we put in and the effort we make towards conservation is having a positive impact. And it's important to remember that. Next slide. And a lot of what we do goes back to this figure I'm sure you've seen before, and about limiting, again, I come back to phosphorus sort of being the most important thing to limit and the thing we have the most control over at the local scale. And this sort of good side, bad side figure I pulled off the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority website. But we know, the work that needs to be done to preserve or conserve healthy shorelines and limit phosphorus, inputs to lakes. Next slide. I'm going to fly through these. Sorry, everyone. I just want to put a quick plug in for a new NSERC Alliance grant that myself and a team of researchers at various universities I'll go over have recently received. And again, this grant comes back into some of these sort of actionable items we can do at the local scale to help conserve our aquatic resources. So it's called Generating Actionable Science to Inform Sustainable Freshwater Ecosystem Use and Shoreline Development in Canada in the face of increasing human pressure. So you might see us out at some of your lakes or sites along the Rideau or Trent River system, canal systems, doing some of this work over the next couple of years. Next slide. And it's driven, part of the call, this grant was part of a larger call looking at how COVID-19 has changed ecosystems, or not ecosystems, changed everything. So we, put this ecosystem spin on it about increasing human pressure on our water resources, our lakes and our rivers as humans, as people, left cities and started, moving more to cottage country. And you just saw more people out on boats, more people out fishing, because a lot of other activities were limited. Next slide. So we're going to be looking at, how best we can, like the best actions to take to limit shoreline erosions. If there is the need to harden your shoreline, how can you do that in the best way? And maybe instead of just putting, cement walls, if you build in some patterns into the cement walls to give algae places to live, you might help in, conserving more biodiversity than if you just built a cement wall by itself, for example. So how can you sort of optimize these artificial structures if you need them? Natural would always be best, but if you do need them, how can you optimize them to sort of get that erosion protection, but also promote biodiversity? Next slide. We're also going to be expanding on this work for invasive macrophyte control. This will be happening more in the Trent, I believe, but maybe a bit in the Rideau, looking at the impacts of what different mechanisms of macrophyte control, like jets, turbojets, mats, cutting, and hopefully we can offer recommendations if you need to provide or alter the shoreline and remove macrophytes, maybe because you have a lot of an invasive macrophyte. How can you best do that to limit ecological impacts and be the most effective in helping promote native macrophyte species? Because aquatic plants are very important to aquatic ecosystems. Next slide. And then we're also going to be looking at the influence of boat wakes. We're seeing more wake boats on our waterways. And, do we need more recommendations on how the distance from shore these wake boats should be used to limit erosion and negative impacts? Next slide. Yeah, so next slide. And this research is being done with our partners at Kawartha Conservation, Rideau Valley Conservation, Parks Canada, and Canadian Wildlife Federation, and is supported by NSERC. So we're really looking forward to getting out there on the lakes. Next year is going to be our first full field season with this project. And hopefully in a few years, having some great data to really help in managing aquatic ecosystems. Next slide. I think this is my last one. Thank you, everyone. So, these stressors aren't new. They're not new pressures. They've just been, magnified and accelerated in part by the pandemic with more people out on our waterways. And the research team for this, we have researchers, myself at Carleton, Vivian, Carleton as well, and Steve Cook, who you probably know at Carleton, Andrea, who's at Ontario Tech University, Stephanie, who's at Toronto Metropolitan University, and Colin Reaney, who's an engineer at Ottawa U. So we'll all be working together at different aspects. So algae, aquatic plants, fish, human, social dimensions, as well as the engineering side to sort of address these questions. And I think I'll stop there because I'm over time, I believe. I'm sorry about that. But thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thank you so much.